So welcome. My name is Ray Engel. I'm a professor at the School of Social Work, and I want to welcome you to Pittsburgh. This is a city that is constantly rated as one of the most livable cities in America, though I think many of our participants in our studies would argue it's not quite livable. That's the most livable for all of the residents of Pittsburgh. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion and research about what the impacts are of raising the minimum wage by $1, by $1.50, by 25 cents. We're all familiar with that. There's been a lot of research to look at what the impact on jobs would be, what the impact would be on employers. In 2012, as we all know, there was and I'll use the word radical without the quotation marks around it, a radical shift in this debate when about 200-300 fast food workers in New York City walked out demanding a wage of $15 an hour and the right to unionize. And I can remember at the time, there was a New York Times article talking about this, and they went and asked an economist, so what would be the impact if we raised wages to $15 an hour? And I don't really know. We've never really talked about it that way before. I guess we would lose jobs. I don't know how many. I guess employers would have more costs. We don't know. And that's sort of what brings us all together today is since 2012, both folks throughout the country have started to really look at and address what happens when wages increase that dramatically. It's our hope that when we first started this, it's not my moment.
That was mine. That was mine saying the conference is starting, sorry.
Yeah, that's quite okay.
It's early, we're here.
So when we first started doing our own work, we thought it would be really important to try to bring people from around the country who are asking different questions about what impact means and what the impact may be in different contexts and different settings. In Pittsburgh, there is no mandated law. Our friends in Seattle have a mandated law. So we have different contexts, and that we could use the information that we get today to help inform stakeholders and policymakers, which is really the process of tomorrow, about what we're learning. So that next time this person is interviewed in the New York Times, they'll actually have something to say. So I want to welcome you all. I appreciate our friends in Seattle. It's some ungodly hour.
5:45.
5:45. Thank you. I don't know if our friend from Madison is on yet.
No, she's not.
So she's probably still sound asleep. But I appreciate all of you for coming, and hopefully we'll all learn something from this experience. So before we begin with our first panel, I'd be remiss without thanking the people who were paying for breakfast. There are a few organizations actually. So our initial grant and what's supporting the symposium came from the University of Pittsburgh Office of the Chancellor through a social science research initiative, which is actually how the faculty of the School of Social Work got to know Sarah Lenardio so well. They've also provided our initial pilot money to gather data in our first year. The Heinz Endowment has made a very large financial contribution to enable us to continue doing the research into years 2 and 3. They've also provided money for us to expand our focus beyond just healthcare workers to organize security guards in Pittsburgh. And finally, our new dean is not here. I'll give a small shout out to the School of Social Work, which has been providing some matching funds that we can use to actually get other money. And Lisa alluded to this, having, did you say, many meetings and contacts with us. The SEIU has been really crucial in providing ideas about how to recruit individuals. Has actually been very helpful in recruiting potential participants to all of our work. They've given us advice about, those kinds of questions are just not going to be answered. They've given us advice about how to think about the problems that we're dealing with. And they've also enabled us to connect with many of the stakeholders that you will see on the second day. So, thank you to all these groups.
Hi, my name is Mark Price. I'm a labor economist at the Keystone Research Center, which is a little think tank based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We chase issues of taxes, wages, unionization, and the broader economy in a state context. And I've been there since 2003, so I think this is my 16th year in the joyous world of public policy in Pennsylvania. Hope always springs eternal, but things will be better. My focus tends to be on income inequality and state tax and budget issues, and also I am now currently being eaten alive by a statewide campaign to try to generate more revenue to fund K-12 education. So that's why.
Good morning. I'm Harry Holzer. I'm a professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown and also a senior fellow at Brookings. I'm a labor economist also. I've spent almost my entire career looking at the low end of the labor market, basically, looking at employment difficulties for minority youth and welfare moms and folks with criminal records. And these days I'm looking at a lot of community colleges and workforce programs and their impact.
Sorry I couldn't join you today. I'm glad to be a participant. I'm Mark Long. I'm a professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. I'm a labor economist, but largely I study transitions of students from high school to college and into the labor market, and got interested in the minimum wage because of the local efforts here in Seattle and a couple other local cities in the state of Washington. Thank you.
So this is actually a perfect time to start our first panel. And Mark, since you're already on a verbal roll, unless we forget you or unless I forget you, maybe you'd like to begin.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So looking at the title of the session on what do we know about the macroeconomic effects of raising wages, when I first saw that title, I was a little slightly intimidated in the sense of thinking about macroeconomy because I'm not a macroeconomist. But I was, when I was a graduate student, I dabbled in being a macroeconomist, and I taught a number of macroeconomic classes. And one of the key lessons you learn from teaching macroeconomics is that the predictions of a macroeconomic model vary quite a bit, whether you're considering a closed economy or an open economy. And I had a student who came up to me after I had taught him introductory macroeconomics, and he was very upset because he was taking intermediate macroeconomics, and he said, everything you taught us in introductory macroeconomics, now they're telling us it's totally different. And after talking to the student and trying to figure out why he's upset and what was the difference, I realized what he was really talking about was the differences in the predictions between an open economy and a closed economy macro. So in a closed economy macroeconomic system, one of the predictions is that interest rates will equilibrate the supply of savings and the demand for investment dollars. Whereas in an open economy, where funds can flow freely across borders, the prediction is that there will be a worldwide interest rate and that net exports will adjust to equilibrate differences between consumption and production. And so I think that frame is useful for thinking about minimum wage studies, and in particular, in understanding that minimum wage studies are going to find different results, partially to the extent to which we're talking about an open versus closed system. And I think this is important because a lot of the minimum wage policies that have been popping up more recently have been at local levels, at city levels, whereas a lot of the research we have is based on what happens when a state or what happens when the country raises its minimum wage. And we might expect there to be a difference in that prediction. So take, for example, Seattle, which is what I'm most familiar with. Seattle has about 700,000 people in the city, or the population is about 700,000, which is about a tenth of the size of the state of Washington. And Seattle, as the size of the Seattle metro area, is only about a fifth of the Seattle metro area. So Seattle is in a porous, more open economy in terms of competition with other local demands for labor. So as a result, when you study something like a local labor market, a local policy, you're likely to find different results because of that extent of trade. And I say that as just an introduction to thinking about the results that we have. I should also preface my remarks by saying I don't consider myself to be an expert in minimum wage literature or minimum wage policy more generally. My interest came because the city adopted a minimum wage, and it adopted it after another city in the state, which is SeaTac, which is the city that surrounds the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, also adopted a $15 minimum wage. So that got several of us in the School of Public Policy interested in, well, what are the effects? And so let me just talk about what we found to date and what it might mean for other areas. So we put out a report or a paper about a year ago that got a lot of publicity because what we found in that study was looking at what was happening to the aggregate employment and wages and hours of low-wage workers in the city of Seattle. And what we found was that when the city increased its minimum wage from a state minimum wage of $9.47 an hour to $11 an hour and then to $13 an hour, particularly when it raised it to $13 an hour, we saw a significant and substantial drop in total employment in the city relative to what we would have expected in the city had they not adopted the minimum wage. We found a 6 to 7% reduction in the total number of hours worked in the city. But we also found that the minimum wage worked as intended and that it raised wages by about 3%. The net result of that, though, is with a 3% increase in wages, increasing earnings, but offset by a 6 to 7% reduction in hours, that leads the total amount of payroll paid to low-wage workers down by 3 to 4%. And so that's awfully concerning, right? It suggests that while the minimum wage ordinance is working as directed, it's raising wages, it's having this offsetting effect and maybe not making workers better off. So that was a study we put out a year ago. Let me talk really briefly about what we've done in the past year. We've been presenting some papers at conferences and at universities on two topics. One on the spillover effect of the minimum wage. So to what extent did Seattle's minimum wage have effects more broadly, and similarly for the minimum wage in SeaTac and also the city of Tacoma, what did their efforts have? And then secondly, if we look at workers longitudinally on an individual basis, do they individually benefit? So on the spillover effects, we did find substantial spillover effects of the policy in the following way. So Seattle raises its wage, and what we find is that for employers that are located within about 40-minute drive of the city, we find that they also raise their wages. Now, not quite as much as Seattle, but they raise their wages about 1 to 2% so a little bit less than half of what Seattle did, but they raised it in the same direction. That suggests that this competition between firms for lower skilled workers, they're all in the same labor market. They have to respond to the higher wage that Seattle is offering. We also then found, though, that those employers also cut their hours by about 1 to 3%. So the aggregate payroll paid to low-wage workers outside of the city was essentially unaffected, but was composed of an increasing hourly wage with a decreasing number of hours. The Tacoma and SeaTac minimum wages did not have the same spillover effects. And largely that's explained by the fact that those two labor markets are less integrated because they're much smaller. They're less integrated with the rest of the state than Seattle's are. So that's on the spillover effects. On the longitudinal side, what we did is we looked at low-wage workers who were employed at baseline, and we followed those workers forward. So we took, for example, workers who were working in Seattle earning less than $11 an hour at baseline and look at their trajectory going forward. And what we found is that the minimum wage actually did benefit those workers. Their wages rose about $1 an hour more than you would have expected based on prior behavior in the city. And their hours also did fall, but less than 1 hour per week. So in net, their earnings went up about $10 a week or $500 a year. So that's a substantial amount of increasing earnings. When we disaggregate that result and compare the workers, the baseline employed workers who had more hours, so think of them as sort of the workers who are more attached to the labor market, those low-wage workers gained all of the benefits. In fact, their earnings went up about $1,000 a year. In contrast, the workers who are less attached to the labor market, who had worked less hours in the past, their earnings went up essentially zero. So what that result suggests is that there's heterogeneity among the employed workers, those who are have more experience and probably thus more skill, all the biggest benefit from the minimum wage. So then you have to ask yourself, well, how do we combine these results of a declining aggregate employment of low-wage work combined with benefits for those workers who are employed at baseline? And the connection between the results is that we also see a decline in the rate of new hires of workers. So essentially the way that Seattle employers are adjusting in terms of reducing their labor demands, mostly it's a demand for new workers. So to sum it up, if you were a pre-existing worker who were employed at baseline, you did well. Your wages went up, your earnings went up, not a lot, but some. If you were non-employed, which probably includes a lot of teenagers, those workers are finding it harder to find work in the city at the $13 wage, which is actually now $15 an hour more recently. The other thing I should say, so those are the papers I've worked on. I'm part of a broader group here at the University of Washington that's done other studies, and one of the studies that was done was a longitudinal survey of employers who had low-wage workers, and they asked the employers, how did you respond to the minimum wage? The most common response was raising prices. So 56% of employers said they raised their prices. But they also reported all kinds of other adjustment strategies, headcounts, limiting internal wage progression, and other responses. Also, finally, I'll say food and accommodation sector employers were more likely to raise their prices than firms in other sectors. And I think that's an important thing to note. So most of the minimum wage literature to date has focused on low-wage employment by using as a proxy fast food work and food service work. That proxy works to some extent. It doesn't always work great when you start talking about a higher, like a $15 minimum wage. And it's also the case that you need to think about the extent to which that good that they're producing is traded across borders. And I would argue that food service is less traded across borders than other types of industries. And so it may be an industry where the response is more about price increases than about labor demand. I'll stop my comments there. Thank you.
So what I prepared was, I say, a broader introduction and broader review of all the literature that came before Mark and his friend in Seattle, and how economists broadly think about this. As with almost everything else in economics, when you mandate a higher wage, there will be a mix of benefits and costs generating a trade-off. And the general trade-off is a lot of folks get higher wages, but the employment rates might decline. And that's simply the concept of a demand curve. In the product market, you raise the price. If everything else stays the same, people buy less. In the labor market, you raise the price of labor, which is the wage, and employers, or the customers in this market, might employ less. That's the hypothesis. Now, how would that work exactly? Well, employers have a lot of mechanisms they could use to make this happen. Number one, they might substitute capital for labor. In other words, they might mechanize, and especially in a world where there's a lot of robotics being developed for fast food and retail, they might move in that direction. Secondly, they might relocate. As Mark said, when it's a region or a locality raising the minimum wage, if across that border the wage remains a lot lower, you might see firms relocate. Or third, they might still hire the same number of workers, but they might actually raise the bar, the hiring bar, and simply demand higher skills, which could be a big disadvantage to the really lowest skilled people who need these jobs the most. And by the way, all this will not happen quickly if it happens all. And I'm going to come back to this because there's some evidence now that the long-run effects on employment are much greater than the short run. And the vast majority of studies are short run within the first year or two of the wage increase. Other factors, what's the strength of the industry in which the wages are going up? What's the strength of the macroeconomy? It's not just that minimum wages affect the economy, but the macroeconomy affects what happens in employment. So if you're in a really tight labor market, like we have right now, it's likely that the minimum wage effects on employment will be very small, right? And employers really need the workers. A lot of people have dropped out of the labor market, so the effects might be modest. Problem is, we're not always going to stay at this level of the macroeconomy. The next time there's a downturn, you might feel a real pinch. And there are other potential losses that economists at least worry about when you raise the minimum wage. And I've mentioned two up here, and I'll mention, Mark reminded me of the third. Economists worry, for instance, that people might get less education. Young people right on the margin between, say, going to community college or work in the labor market might be enticed to skip the labor market and go get the jobs which are now more attractive at the higher minimum wage. And again, that means they're putting a lot more, economists call that a high discount rate. They put a lot more emphasis right now on being paid and not thinking as much about their future earnings. Secondly, employers might choose to train less. And this is a basic concept out of human capital theory, that most employers don't want to invest their own resources in training workers, especially if the training is kind of a general nature, because they might invest in these workers and then the workers leave tomorrow and maybe go work for their competitor. So employers don't want to spend their own money. They'll only do it by paying a lower wage up front. We have a minimum wage that prevents the employer from paying a lower wage up front. And again, people argue how much training is really going on in these markets, but at least that's the theory. And then the third one is the one Mark talked about, the higher consumer prices, which are a bigger issue, again, from really large minimum wage increases. What you really worry about are low-income folks who don't benefit from the minimum wage. I mean, there's a lot of households that don't have any workers. They're not getting any of the benefits of the minimum wage, and they're actually seeing the prices they have to pay for go up. So people without minimum wage workers in the household, including low-income families, could be made worse off, not just because of the loss of employment, but the higher prices they have to pay. Now, these are all hypotheses, right? We don't know. I'm just laying the economic reasoning out. And if we talk about hypotheses, there's also forces that could move potentially in the other direction. Number one, maybe workers work harder when they're paid better. Maybe their productivity goes up. Maybe they quit less. Maybe they fill vacant jobs more rapidly. So there might be these offsets to the higher costs that lessen the burden on employers when these wages go up. And it's going to depend a lot also on how big the wage increases are in the first place, which I'll come back to. But at the end of the day, it's all an empirical question, right? As usual, there's theory that goes this way, theory that goes that way. So the empirical question is, how large are the wage benefits? To whom do they accrue? Is it really to poor people or not? And then is there evidence of employment losses? How big are they? And who suffers the employment loss? And then you get the magnitudes of the trade-off. And literally, this is one of those one of those issues that economists have been wrestling with for 40 plus years. And there's been literally hundreds of empirical studies on the minimum wage, and yet the profession is still arguing about its effects. And there's lots of stuff we don't know. So I'll try to summarize a little bit about how I read this literature. And if we go to the next slide, just put some of the basic facts on the table that a lot of folks might know. The statutory federal minimum remains 7.25. The last time it went up was 2009. So we're going on a decade since the last time minimum wages have gone up at the federal level. Right now, at the federal level, that wage is about 36% of the median wage. The median wage right now is very close to $20 an hour. And that's low by historical standards. Right? It's unusual to go this long without a minimum wage increase. Historically, the feds would often bump the minimum wage up to 50% of the median, and then wait a bunch of years and it would decline, then they bump it up again, it would decline. So it was always in that kind of 40 to 50% range usually. Letting it fall to 35% or less is somewhat unusual, but of course states and localities are allowed to have higher minimum wages. So about 30 states have already gone beyond that federal minimum, and increasingly localities. Most of the states so far have gone up to the $8 to $10 an hour range. There are a few that have embraced 15, but they're phasing it in pretty slowly. And of course, Seattle has already gotten to 15, but most other places are phasing it in gradually, partially because of the warnings of economists. If you do it too quickly, you can really hurt these businesses. Some of these states and localities are indexing it to inflation. Some are not, and I think that has an effect on the employment impacts. And then lastly, this is a really important point. Who actually gets paid the minimum? Because if you listen to the advocates, they talk a lot about low-income, poor adults, either below the poverty line or right near the poverty line, often single earners in those families, single parents or single earners. And the argument is those folks need a living wage to be able to support their families. But it turns out poor adults, especially in single-parent houses, are actually a fairly small part of the minimum wage population. By most studies I've seen, they're somewhere in the ballpark of 30% of the total. So who are the other 70%? They're mostly two groups. Number one, young people, teenagers, but also people in their early 20s, often college students or, with a part-time or a summer job, and second earners in families, often the people, the stay-at-home parent who might go out and get a part-time job, 10, 20 hours a week, and therefore get a low-wage job. The vast majority of groups 2 and 3 are not poor. On average, their incomes tend to be a little bit below the median. So I think something like 60% of the families to whom the youth and the second earners belong to are below the median income, but they are mostly not poor. It's not a very well-targeted policy in terms of the poor. And there's other policies better targeted. So the real concern is that you'll bump the minimum wage way up. This is the fear again. This is not about the evidence. That maybe a lot of the people who benefit will be people with somewhat higher skills, like the second earners and youth, and that the most vulnerable people potentially actually might be the ones who lose their jobs if, in fact, there was an employment effect. So those are just the concerns that people have raised. Next slide. So historically, as I said, there have been literally hundreds of studies on the minimum wage, and I think the results can be sort of summarized. There's sort of been two bodies of work on this. One set of, and I'm going to focus on what I call the credible studies, not the ones with kind of outlandish results in either direction. There's a group of studies that find no loss at all, and there's another group of studies that find pretty modest losses. What I would call modest would be for a 10% increase in the minimum wage, it might reduce employment by a percentage point or two among the affected groups. And again, 80% of the population, 85% of the population are not going to show any impact at all. It's only that bottom 10 or 15% of workers, the youngest, the least skilled, that are impacted one way or the other. And as you probably know, until about 20 years ago, most of this work was econometric, and the summary of the work was, about a 1 or 2 percentage point loss for a 10% increase. And then probably you may know there's been controversy in the last 20 years because David Card and Alan Kruger did this famous study of Burger King's. They found no effect. Then David Newmark took their data and they fought back and he said there was an effect in their data. And now there's a group coming out of Berkeley, Sylvia Allegretto, Michael Reich, Aaron Dubé. They again find no impacts. David Newmark fights with them. And, and really you go back and forth. Small tweaks to the model can move you back and forth between these results. So in some ways, either result you could get. So the sensible thing is kind of take an average of the two. And that's what the CBO did in 2014, in early 2014, and I think that's an important point. The report was written in 2013, before the fight for 15 really took off. And at the time, one of the most progressive proposals was the Obama proposal for a $10 minimum wage. And so the CBO took an average of all those empirical studies out there and said, well, our estimate is if the minimum wage gradually went up to $10 an hour, it would raise wages for 16 to 24 million people. And the idea was 16 million people's wages would directly be raised, and potentially another 8 million to people just above the minimum who might get further bumped up. Because there's some employers who always want to be $1 or $2 above the minimum. They said it would also reduce the number of people below the poverty line by 1 million. Right? So that gives you some sense, 16 to 24 million people getting a pay increase, only 1 million going above the poverty line. But some people were already just above, they get bumped up. Some people were way below, they might come closer. But they did say there was a cost, and their best estimate, and they said there's a wide standard error around this estimate, their best estimate that it would eliminate about 500,000 jobs over a 3 million period, half of those 500,000 for teenagers, and the others for older youth or adults. Now, I looked at those numbers and said, to me, that's not a bad trade-off. And I might be willing to sacrifice 500,000 jobs to see 16 to 24 million people get a raise, given that at least some of those people really are going to be low-income folks. So I read the trade-off as being fairly positive. Interestingly, at the time, the 500,000 number got way more press than the 16 to 24 million. So that killed any discussion, at least in Congress, of any wage increase. But next slide. So I have some additional concerns about where we are right now in a world where the fight for 15 is really spreading and a lot of cities and states are jumping on the bandwagon. So I list 5 of my concerns that go beyond what the CBO report projected 4 or 5 years ago. The first point is the point that Ray made and the point that Mark made. $15 is way outside the range of what most of the research was done on. And I believe, so we don't have any real evidence yet at all on 15. My guess, based on what we've learned in economics, is that the employment losses per dollar are likely a lot bigger in that $13 to $15 range than at the sort of traditional lower range. And the reason for that, what I'm basically saying is, in the language of researchers, that the employment effects are going to be nonlinear, and that they start off being pretty small, if you're in that traditional range of only 40 to 50% of the median, but that's going to be much bigger. And by the way, $15 an hour, depending on where you are. In Seattle is a high price, high wage, high skill city. So 15 there might not be that far above 50% of the median. In many localities, when entire states like California and New York embrace that wage, it's likely to go way above 50% of the median and potentially have a much larger employment loss. And why do I think the effects might be non-linear? Because there's adjustment costs. If you remember some of the things I said employers might do, they might introduce more machines, they might relocate. Those are costly to do in reality. So a lot of employers, if you had a modest minimum wage increase, a lot of employers say, oh, that's not worth worrying about. It's not worth bearing those huge adjustment costs. But all of a sudden, when you get to 15, the adjustment costs might not look that bad, and it might be worth the while of employers. And of course, it's not an either or, but with every extra dollar of increase, presumably more employers would find it worth their while to bear those adjustment costs and like I said, and hire fewer of these workers either by relocating or by automating or just raising the bar at the entry level. Secondly, we've learned recently that the long-run employment losses look much bigger than the short-run costs. Almost all of the previous literature, I think including the studies that Mark and his colleagues have done, are short-run. They look a year or two out after the minimum wage increase. There's, I think, some very important work by an economist, a young economist named Isaac Sorkin, who's now an assistant professor at Stanford. He's a Michigan PhD, a student of John Bound. He found, and again, it wasn't a traditional statistical study. He was looking at different mechanisms and projecting out. His prediction was the employment loss, even of moderate increases, over the long run might be 3 times as large as the ones we estimated in the short run. And his argument was that existing establishments don't change their hiring by very much, but gradually, in a high-wage jurisdiction, the mom and pop shops gradually go out of business and are replaced by the franchises and which are more capital intensive. And therefore, and it happens very gradually. So you're looking 10, 15 years out. He says his short run estimates are at the low end, just like the literature predicts, about 0.1 a 1% employment loss, again, of the affected groups for a 10% minimum wage increases, he thinks they're about 3 times as high over a 15-year period. So that also, and that's just of the modest increases. It argues that if he's right, the $15 increases might have much bigger effects in the short run and really big employment losses in the long run, potentially. The third problem is this indexing. I think indexing is something else. And there's been, Allegretto and Reich and Dubé claim to find no effective indexing. Michael Strain at the American Enterprise Institute claims to find that effective indexing. But again, it kind of makes sense because historically, small minimum wage increases, a lot of employers that think to themselves, again, it's not worth reorganizing here and cutting jobs. Eventually, inflation will eat away at that minimum wage increase. We'll just wait it out. When you index it, that doesn't happen. Then the wage increases are permanent. And when that happens, that also could, and especially the combination of going to 15 and indexing really might make it a lot more attractive for employers to reorganize or relocate or something to cut back on employment. And again, these are my concerns. I can't prove any of this, but these are my reasons to not be as sanguine about 15 as I was about the 8 to 10 range. Number 4, state and local laws, and Mark alluded to this a little. You can make an argument about why it's either good or not good for these localities when these states do this. The argument in favor is that the economic and labor market circumstances are really different in different locations. So Seattle, relative to most other places, is a high-skilled, high-priced city, and the argument in Seattle probably makes more sense than in many other places that are now jumping on 15, like LA and Washington, D.C. But there's also a cost, because the smaller the region covered by the minimum wage, depending on what's happening right over the border of the jurisdiction, the incentives either to relocate or do something like that could be very large. So I live in the Washington, D.C. region. I live in Maryland. D.C. and the 2 southernmost counties in Maryland, Montgomery and Prince George's, have adopted 15, and they're gradually bumped up to 15. Right across the Potomac River in Virginia, you have Arlington that's staying at 7.25. That's a really, really large disparity just across the border. And it seems to me you're creating a lot of incentives for firms to gradually shift across that border. Even people in the tourist trade. It's not that hard to stay in a hotel in Arlington and to Uber into D.C., but to get much lower priced food and much lower priced housing, et cetera. And again, not everybody's going to do that. Some employers are going to really, really want to be where the action is in downtown in the district, but gradually, over time, you could see a trickle or more than a trickle going in that direction. And finally, what are the effects on training? Even if it's mostly teenagers who are losing these jobs, it's harder for them to pick up early work experience. And that early work experience really has a big effect on the wages down the road. That's where a lot of so you're postponing for the people who can't find employment, you are potentially wiping out that early work experience that's important to them. If we lived in a country or in a state where there's a lot of public sector, public service employment, publicly provided employment to pick up that slack, you'd be much less worried about this if employers take that early work experience seriously. But that's not where we live in most places. So the people, and it might not be that some people are permanently unemployable. It might be that they just get less employment, but over time, you really might wipe out the work experience of young people who really need it, not offset by anything else. At least those are my concerns. And so where I come out personally in this debate, I support what I think are moderate increases in the federal minimum. I would go up to 10, maybe 10.50, something like that at the federal. I would support somewhat higher than that in high wage, high price, high skill jurisdictions. I would go up to 12, 12.50, 13 in those other places. But I would keep it more moderate than 15 in most places. And then I would supplement. Again, there are other tools in the toolkit that also might help these workers. And I would put a little less emphasis on the minimum wage. And again, a lot of people, the people who keep their jobs, as Mark emphasized, are going to love the $15 an hour. And they might well be the majority of the people in this market over time. I just put a lot of weight on that group of people who do lose their jobs. And I said over time, it might not be a very small group. So I list 5 things on my slide that you would supplement the minimum wage increase. The first one, of course, is maintaining and expanding the Affordable Care Act. You supplement people's low wages with other publicly provided benefits. One of the most important is health insurance. Now, right now, it's not the time to think about expanding. It's the time to think about protecting the gains that occurred. But I think there's a huge argument in favor of ACA in a world where a lot of people earn less than $15 an hour, or even if they earn $15 an hour. So number one, shore up healthcare. Number two, I would support all kinds of EITC, earned income tax credit expansions. Federal government already spends about $70 billion a year on EITC, and then states and localities spend more. But there's some groups really left out. The workers most left out of the earned income tax credit are childless adults, either who don't have kids at all or who don't have custody of their kids. And since I've written a lot about this population of low-income men, often with criminal records, who don't have custody of their kids, they get like a $500 a year EITC. The vast majority of them don't even bother to get it. They don't even know about it. It's so small, it's so trivial. So I would support a big expansion of the childless credit, and also some increase. The one-child credit is much less generous than 2 or more children. I would support expanding those in lieu of the $15 minimum wage. Of course, the third place I'd go would be to enhance education and training. That would open up a whole discussion of workforce policies that I won't get into. But I think the real action is at the community college level. And by the way, the real important legislation at the federal level is not the stuff coming out of the Department of Labor. It's not WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It's on the education. It's Pell Grants and Title IV loans and things like that. That affects vastly more people, and that affects what you do at community colleges. There's a lot you could do at community colleges, all kinds of reforms, funding for proven supports that would make it easier, not just for low-income youth and adults to get some community college credential, a certificate, an associate degree, but those that have immediate market value. And right now, people often stumble around blindly at community college. They don't know what has market value and what doesn't. But you can do more to push people in the direction of certificates and associate degrees with high market value and make those more attainable. Number 4 on my list was, of course, regulations to protect workers, one of which, of course, is protecting the right to bargain collectively. That's a real hard road right now, especially in the private sector. But there's other things I think that can be done. You've heard a lot recently about employers imposing things like non-disclosure agreements on their workers, things like that. That's a place where I think you can have sensible regulation and some states like Massachusetts are already moving in that direction to make it harder for employers to impose these really anti-competitive rules on their workers. And lastly, number 5, I would expand supports for what we might call high road employers. Labor economists have known this for a long time. We teach our students that there's one market clearing wage in any given market, and that's really not true, right? We know in any market, any detailed industry in any region, you always have a range of wages, and you have employers who go to the high end. They invest more in training their workers. They compete on the basis of worker quality and product quality. And there's a lot of employers who go to the low end and compete on the basis of the lowest labor costs possible. And in any market, you can find some of those. Historically, places like Costco were the high-wage employer. Walmart was the low-wage employer. Actually, Walmart got really tired of having that reputation, and they are actually gradually moving their wages up and investing more in training. My view is employers make that choice on what's good for them, but in fact, the high-road employers provide a strong public good for the rest of the economy and the rest of the workers. And if you provide a public good, there's an argument for the government subsidizing that and supporting it. So I favor state, local, federal governments providing more supports to high-road employers. We don't have an enormous amount of evidence on how you do that effectively. So we need a lot more research in that area. But at a minimum, more supports for high-road employers in terms of tax credits and technical assistance and relocation transformation grants, and maybe some tax credits for apprenticeships or profit sharing, some of the other things these high-road employers do. And I think that package of supports combined with a moderately higher minimum wage, to me, makes more sense over time than shooting up to 15 and doing nothing else. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Harry, thank you so much. That was great. You've given us a good whole new research agenda.
There you go.
So finally, I'll turn to Mark to speak a bit about what they're doing at Keystone.
Sure. So, Mark does very interesting research, and I'm sort of looking forward to seeing the various work that comes out. And I thank you for speaking up, because I thought you did a nice job sort of laying out the lay of the land in the economics profession. I think because I'm the Pennsylvania plant in the room, at least from Harrisburg, not from Pittsburgh, sorry, I'll sort of try to add in that additional context. And one of the things that most of you are familiar with is there's been a broad sort of pulling apart of wages and incomes in the U.S. economy in the last 35, 45 years. So the way I like to think of it is, get a slinky in your hand and pull it apart, right? And the top incomes at the top have risen rather rapidly. Incomes and wages have fallen at the bottom, and the distance between workers has sort of stretched out. In the minimum wage context, in Pennsylvania in 1968, which was a historical peak in terms of the purchasing power of the minimum wage, the minimum wage was $1.60 an hour in that time's prices. And the median wage for the typical full-time, full-year worker in Pennsylvania was $3.15 an hour. So that was basically half, right? The minimum wage worker in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, could expect to earn half what the typical sort of middle-class worker would be earning at that time. And then, as Harry has very well pointed out, that ratio has declined over time. So that today, our estimate is that a minimum wage worker in Pennsylvania earns a little less than a third of the income of the typical median wage, full-time, full-year worker. And that, of course, is the broad context which is driving minimum wage campaigns, right? And when I was a graduate student myself, we called them living wage campaigns. We didn't call them the Fight for 15, but there was an effort across the country to boost wages. And in particular, in cities like Pittsburgh that tend to be more supportive of these kind of measures, you get this sort of pressure where localities go up, and that drives states to boost their wages, and that puts pressure on other states across the country. Here in Pennsylvania, we are in a somewhat unique situation in the sense that we don't have a referendum process. So it's not possible, Lisa's not in the room, so she can't get offended that I might suggest this, but the unions in Pennsylvania cannot pay folks to go out and get signatures and to put a referendum on the ballot to raise wages. That's just not possible here in Pennsylvania the way we're structured. You have to go through the General Assembly. So the end result is that there's been no action even at the state level to raise the minimum wage. And furthermore, we have a practice in law that basically preempts local governments like the city of Pittsburgh or the city of Philadelphia or Allentown from enacting their own minimum wage ordinances covering private sector workers. And they can still have living wage ordinances to cover their contractors or folks that work for them directly. They cannot go to McDonald's and tell them they have to pay a higher minimum wage. That's all sort of driven by the state's decisions. Now, the end result of that policy is that we are the only state in the region, as many of you probably are very familiar, to have not raised minimum wage. West Virginia, Ohio, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and D.C. have all raised their minimum wage, some more than others. Certainly New York is on the way to 15, at least within the city itself and some of its outlying counties, and the rest of the state is moving up as well. I think our expectation is that you'll probably see the state of Maryland moving in the direction eventually of 15. There is a campaign there. In the case of New Jersey and Ohio, those were places, as you might be aware, that had more conservative governors in the last several years, yet their minimum wage kept going up precisely because they were places that had already enacted, through public referenda, inflation adjustments. So that's something that sort of lifted their wages, even though their governors have not been supportive of higher minimum wages there. So the action here is in the General Assembly. The General Assembly has a conservative proposal, which is to raise the minimum wage to about $9 an hour. That would be about 39% of what the typical median full-time, full-year worker would make in Pennsylvania. The governor has proposals for $12 an hour. That gets you to 49%. So the governor's proposal will get you roughly back to where we were in 1968. And then in the General Assembly, the Democratic caucus of the General Assembly has put forward bills that would first raise to 12 and then eventually in dollar increments reach 15 by 2024. None of these bills are going anywhere anytime soon. We do have a Republican sponsor for one of the $9, in the range of $9, but that has not generated any interest, at least in the leadership of the General Assembly. So we will remain stuck. Now that is bad news, of course, but it's also good news for the researchers because it's generating, again, lots of variation that folks are going to be able to take advantage of. You can compare what's going on in New York across the border with Pennsylvania, likewise in every other surrounding state. So it's creating opportunities to flesh out and look in the way that Mark has done in the case of Seattle at what are the broader effects. I think, one sort of note that I would make is that the city of Seattle, the median wage, basically the $13 an hour wage was just about 50% of the median wage for full-time workers in that city. When you look across the literature, and Harry alluded to this, most of the research literature that's been done up to this point is covering minimum wages that are relative to median, somewhere in the range of a third to 55%, where more obviously are lower in that range. So the Seattle estimate, the increase that occurred there, at least to 13, is sort of at the top of that range. And of course, if you're looking at Pennsylvania, going to 15 takes you well outside. So I think that sort of provides context in that it's my estimation, because I'm one of the partisan folks in Harry's categorization, right? They're the folks who find no loss, then moderate loss. I'm on the no loss team with Allegretto and Reich. So the 9 and 12 likely aren't going to have broad negative effects, setting aside the long-term issues that Harry brings up. 15 is more unknown. I think I would probably also add that, in evaluating these proposals, certainly job loss is a concern, especially as you go higher. But I wouldn't sort of rule that out. And as Harry made a very good point, when focusing on CBO study, basically about 3% of folks would lose their job as a result of that policy, but the average wage would go up. And in fact, there's good reason to argue that when we tend to think of, when we're teaching sort of textbook economics to students, we tend to think of a sort of a very stylized version of the world. You have a minimum wage increase and then there's massive job loss and people remain unemployed forever. It's important to remember that there is lots of churn, especially at the bottom end of the labor market. So even if someone is employed at a local pizza shop and that pizza shop is driven out of business by a minimum wage increase, they're not going to remain unemployed for the full year. And so one of the important things to focus on in evaluating these increases over time certainly is whether annual wages or annual incomes go up. So you could still lose a job, you'll find another one shortly at a higher wage and still end the year better off. The last thing I want to point out is that within the literature, Mark's first study, his employment losses are 3 times larger than the typical loss that's observed by David Newmark and William Washer, so the moderate loss group. So Mark's early results, and I haven't seen the later work, is clearly outside the bounds of what existing research has found. And that raises a question. Is that because those are real effects, or is there something else going on? And I think we're waiting to see some additional research. We'll see Mark's updates as we go. There is existing research from Sylvia Allegretto and Michael Reich and Anna Godfrey, again, focusing on Seattle over the same period, focusing on the quarterly census of employment and wages, where they again find certainly wages go up in restaurants, but they do not observe a loss in employment either overall or within limited service or fast food, the places that you might expect to find them. So this is a pretty vibrant literature. And we will see as time passes, as other work is done, as Mark updates his work going forward, we'll sort it out in terms of its impacts. I think I would sort of follow that in addition to the decline in wages, we've also observed a rapid decline in union density, right? So 1 in 4 Pennsylvania workers were members of unions in the early 80s. Today, that figure is 1 in 8. So, and that is a serious issue because as union membership declines, you get fewer of the beneficial effects that has on wages. You get fewer of what we sometimes call threat effects, in that employers seeking to avoid unionization will raise wages for individual workers in order to sort of discourage people like Lisa having success organizing those new workers. And so as density falls, you lose some of those effects. And as Harry mentioned, we now have a growing sort of body of research that demonstrates that a lot of particularly low-wage employers are engaging in collusion in ways that are ultimately detrimental to low-wage workers. Roughly, Alan Kruger and Orly Ashenfelter have found that 58% of franchise agreements, and these are covering Jiffy Lube, McDonald's, H&R Block, the tax service, 58% of franchisees have no poaching agreements in their contracts, which basically means if you have a worker at a local McDonald's and he wants to get a job or she wants to get a job at a McDonald's down the street by another franchisee, the agreement requires that they do not hire that worker. This is a pernicious problem because as the economy expands, right, employers, following a recession, employers have a big pool of workers to draw from. But as that pool shrinks, one of the solutions that employers can use, they will use others, seeking out other avenues, other groups of workers to appeal to, but one of the avenues they have of responding to a falling pool of workers applying for their jobs is to raise wages on offer, right? And so a worker who works at McDonald's and hears of an opening down the street at another McDonald's that's paying higher wages, those provisions, no poaching agreements, are actually basically short-circuiting that process of raising wages in the broader economy. In fact, we see that in the data that in the late 1970s, the unemployment rates necessary for the median worker, the threshold unemployment rate, below which you will see a rise in wages for the median worker, it was around 6.7%. So as the unemployment rate falls nationally below 6.7%, you begin to see growth in median wages for workers in the economy faster than inflation. That has fallen to the early 2000s to 5.1%. And in fact, in the last 12 months, if you've been paying attention to the news lately, we discovered that the unemployment rate averaging at 4.1%, we have seen no real wage growth in the U.S. economy. So that you have these sort of combined trends, falling bargaining power through the absence of unions, collusion by employers in ways that are depressing the growth in wages for low-wage workers, and the fall in the purchasing power of the minimum wage, and sort of this spreading out of the income distribution, all of which are feeding back and limiting both the growth in wages for workers, but also generally distributing income in a way that I think is ultimately harmful. If you look at income growth in Pennsylvania from 1945 to 1973, the top 1% of families took home 3.4% of all income growth. Certainly it's more than 1%, right? The period from 1973 to 2015, the top 1% of families took home 46% of income growth. So these trends, the falling purchasing power of the minimum wage, declining unionization, collusion by employers, are all combining to distribute income up in a way that ultimately I think is unhealthy. So I think certainly raising the minimum wage is a good and sound policy. It would be nice if I could magically wave a wand, and I would certainly be willing, unlike Harry, to go for 15 by 2024. But that's certainly not going to happen. I think in the political process here in Pennsylvania, if it ever happens, we will get some kind of compromise in the neighborhood of maybe 9, maybe 10 if you're lucky. The way these things work out, the advocates never get quite what they want. In fact, that's one way to look at this, is that the movement for higher wages has sort of grown up. Maybe it's effective, maybe it's not. Moving away from the argument, we need living wages, which is what we would argue in the 90s. We've moved on to we want 15. And the 15 is an aspiration. In some places it's been achieved. And I think we'll do some additional research to find out what the impacts are. But Harry's also absolutely correct that the way in which that it's not the only policy you pursue. You want to pursue a wide range of things, including banning employers, as Massachusetts is doing. Pennsylvania is working with Massachusetts to try to make sure that these franchise agreements are not enforced. You want to have an expanded earned income tax credit. There were proposals to do that by a group of people who thought they were going to be working in the Clinton White House, and obviously those died, and we'll see. They'll come back at some point. So certainly there's a wide range of things that you need to do to help workers that are beyond simply raising wages through the earned income tax credit, increasing bargaining power through more unions, stopping collusive behavior. So it's not, minimum wage is not the only solution, but it's certainly a very important part of the mix. If your goal, and my goal is very clearly to compress the wage distribution, and certainly compressing it from the bottom of the higher minimum wage is certainly appropriate. So with that, that's it for my comments.
So I want to thank Mark and Harry. I think they've really given us some things to think about. I think it's an opportunity for us to have both conversation and questions. We've got three great people to help answer those questions. I thought I would start with one while you're thinking opportunity. That's what I really want to ask. All three of you have really indicated that context is really important. The location and the contextual issues around that location. I mean, Harry, you talked about Seattle versus Los Angeles. We have our own context in Pennsylvania. Obviously, Mark, you're working in Seattle as well, that may be different than other communities. So maybe each of you can speak a little to what you think are the key contextual variables that we need to consider, and does that mean that we actually have to have really locality-centered policies around what wages might be, or what this minimum wages might be?
So I can take a crack at that. So number one, I would look at the fraction of the demographics of the workers in the regional labor market, and how many of them, for instance, are high school or less, as opposed to BA or higher. The larger the group of unskilled workers, I think the more cautious you want to be. And that's why I think if there's any city in the country where 15 might make sense, it might be Seattle. And even there, Mark and his colleagues will tell us eventually. But that's a high-skill city, so there's fewer unskilled workers competing for those low-wage jobs. Of course, another dimension of demographics are the immigrant population. And again, I'm talking about the relatively unskilled, sort of the bottom-skill immigrants, not the people coming with engineering degrees. And there's a lot of them in LA. And one of the things, of course, I fear about a place like LA or DC, that there's a lot more of these people are going to be hired off the books. That employers are not going to be, employers are not going to be willing to hire a lot of these people if they have to pay them $15 an hour. So they will increasingly move to off the books for them. Thirdly, I would look at what's happening just over the border. And are there big disparities? I get in the DC area, as soon as you cross that Virginia border, you're in a whole different world. So I would look at that and even some of the demographics of across the border. And I guess fourth, the industry mix and the size mix. And I heard in some of the pre-meeting conversations, there was talk about maybe only applying a high minimum wage to the really big employers. Big employers historically are also higher wage and higher skill employers. So maybe it makes sense to do that. But then you create these funny incentives for some employers not to grow when they get close to that border. But I think those are the first things I would look at. And of course the ratio, both Mark Price and I talked the ratio of the minimum wage to the median wage in whatever that jurisdiction is. Now I had a slight difference. It depends how you measure these things. When I talked about the federal minimum being 35%, I was including all workers, not just full-time. And so I don't know when they say full-time, if you're really only looking at full-time workers, that number is going to look a lot lower, the ratio, because in fact it's the part-time workers who often have the low wages. So if the ratio is 55%, when only looking at the full-time workers, total it might be 60 or 70%. Depending on exactly if you're only looking at full-time workers or if you're looking overall. So, but that ratio is very important as well.
Mark, you are?
Yeah, I think the contextual question is huge. And let me talk about a couple contextual factors in Seattle that might make the results we find different than elsewhere. One is that the state's minimum wage is indexed, and Harry talked about indexing. So the state's minimum wage has been indexed since 1998, And it was, as a result, $9.47 when Seattle increased its minimum wage. And at that time, it was the highest state minimum wage in the country. So that matters for what we're going to find. The second contextual factor is Seattle's been undergoing a boom, partly as a result of Amazon, but more generally, there's a tech boom. The city of Seattle between 2009 and 2016 increased its population from 600,000 to 700,000. If you stop and think about that for a second, 100,000 more people trying to find housing in a city. We didn't get 100,000 more housing units in that 7-year period. And so housing costs are rising very rapidly. And so in some regards, what we might have found was an inflection point where it simply becomes unaffordable for low-wage workers to live in the city and for businesses employing low-wage workers to locate in the city. So in one other factor, so Harry mentioned nonlinear results. We didn't find a significant negative employment effect going from 947 to 11. It's when the city went from 11 to 13. Right at that moment, that's when we saw the disemployment effects. And so that suggests that there may be a threshold. But again, it's a local context, and you need to consider that. One last comment. It's useful to step back and think, what would be the perfect design for studying a minimum wage? If I could wave my magic wand, not on policy, but on program evaluation, what would I do? Well, I'd probably take the 100 largest cities in the country, and I'd randomly assign 50 of them to raise their minimum wages and 50 of them not, and then evaluate them over some period of time, let's say 10 years. We don't have that, right? We don't have that perfect experimental context. In the case of Washington, the state voters voted for a minimum wage increase in 2016, which is going to raise the state's minimum wage $12 an hour over a few years, and then be indexed. And that kicked in 2017, which makes studying Seattle past 2017 harder because now our control group has also increased its minimum wage, right? So we'll never have this perfect kind of experimental context to conduct this research. And I think we should just be aware of that. There is no magic study coming along down the pike that's going to tell us this is the effect of the minimum wage. We have to take what we get with these local policy changes and recognize that they are contextual and they need to be understood in that contextual frame.
Yeah, I think I would probably share Harry's, advice that when you think about, what would we raise the minimum wage to in Pittsburgh if we could, you'd want to think about where median wage for full-time, full-year workers happens to be, and evaluate your increase relative to that. That's certainly a first step. Of course, having said that, I'm a labor economist who's been sentenced to a life of trying to dig up local data, and those kinds of challenges will make me want to pull my hair out if you call me and ask me to figure that out.
I don't have to worry about that.
Lucky you. So I think certainly, get what you can in terms of demographic detail, but also really, as the work you're doing now illustrates, you want to marshal all the resources you can to explore sort of what are the impacts on workers of raising their wages, both the good and the bad, in terms of how it affects their lives and access to resources, but also how it might change their decisions and how that might look in a political context. Right? These are always very brutal political fights where there isn't a lot of room for error. So focus on key areas. There are a lot of workers who are employed in nonprofit sector, right? And so you want to think carefully about the implications of the wage you choose on that sector, because it's going to get resources maybe from Allegheny County or the state at large. And so you want to, in addition to think about, just getting the increase, but also think about what those kinds of institutions need to absorb those costs, right? Because if you're talking about a child care provider, they're going to look at you like you're evil, right? If you suggest they should be paying $15 an hour, because they're going to have to turn around and charge that to parents. And those of you who are parents know quite well, child care is very expensive. So think about those knock-on effects, and also think about creative ways that you can get additional supports to do the things that Harry's talking about, ways in which to target workers who may not necessarily benefit from a minimum wage increase, low-income folks who are not attached to the labor market or have low skills, move in the direction of finding those kind of resources would also be a good idea.
So are there questions or thoughts or comments people would like to make?
So I have a question for Harry on the CBO report that aggregates everything. What was the result on prices after they aggregate this?
They didn't study. Right?
Yeah, that was I don't think they studied
so
that. Yeah. Now, there is other literature. This guy named Daniel Aronson, I think it's the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Wisconsin PhD, who has looked at that. And it's, again, the increases are quite modest historically because the minimum wage increases were modest. Now, I would expect more substantial increases. And Tom McCurdy wrote a paper, came out in the journal Political Economy 2 or 3 years ago, where he made this argument that those price increases were so bad that more and so few poor people actually worked in these minimum wage jobs that the average poor person was significantly worse off. That's one study. It's a bit of an outlier compared to Aronson and other folks. But again, in a $15 an hour world, we might. And again, my concern about 15 is there'll be some significant price increase. I worry that the automation or the relocation will just occur a lot faster, and that at 15 there will be a lot more incentives for companies to develop robotics for fast food or retail. And again, retail is already being automated, and we're moving a lot more. They go to the Amazon, the online, the fulfillment centers. I just think you'll see a lot more of that in fast food, just everything becoming automated faster than it otherwise would. And I guess that's why I don't share Mark's belief that, they might lose jobs for a little while, they'll pretty easily find it. I'm guessing that won't be true, that when everybody's forced to, except for the folks hiring off the books. But that there won't, those kind of alternative low-wage opportunities will not be there if the minimum wage is seriously enforced. And so I'm not as convinced that people who lose out can quickly find something else.
But if you had wraparound services, ways in which to help folks find employment, let's say in a perfect world, would you really care that fast food went away?
No, but the question is, where are those other jobs going to be that these people, right? And if you're really enforcing the 15, I don't know where else they're going to go in that jurisdiction. Now, again, you might encourage them to cross, to transport them to, say in Maryland, Howard County or one of these other places.
So I totally share that sort of, that's a concern, is you don't want people to not find employment. But I'll also sort of invoke the traditional annoying economist sort of view. I like technological change, right? It's good for us, it's good for the economy. I don't miss and the younger graduate students won't remember this, I do not miss the Blockbuster video store or the local video store. I'm sorry. My life has significantly improved thanks to technological innovation, right? Which I don't think had anything to do with trends in wages. In fact, if anything, the trend in wages in places like Pennsylvania has been down, right? We're not talking about an environment where wages have been rapidly rising. Workers have been losing income. So I think technological change is a good thing, and I don't care if I end up getting a hamburger out of a vending machine. As
long as those low-skill have somewhere else to go. That's
absolutely correct. And that's the real challenge. I mean, can we, and this will be a way that Harry will explode. I mean, are there ways, maybe not. I think Harry supports, we need to think seriously about public employment opportunities, right? Whether you do that through subsidized jobs, giving employers an incentive, therefore lowering wages that they actually have to pay to their workers, or whether you do it through more radical means like a public job guarantee. That's certainly absolutely critical because, as I look at my little terrible town, I have a local diner, right? And they are the primary beneficiary of falling minimum wages. They have no trouble recruiting workers to work for very, very low wages. And I think in an environment where folks had employment opportunities, that in itself would go a long way towards moving wages in a direction that's good. And I think we have to recognize that when wages rise, employers are going to take paths, whether they're going to raise prices on a bag of French fries, or they're going to invent a new machine or put the hamburger in a vending machine, or they're going to invest in training their workers. There are always different paths. Our focus in economics is always on employment because that's probably the easiest thing to measure. It's the easiest thing to look at. But the real action and the fun stuff, which is what you're sort of doing, is, what else? What do employers do? And James Parrott in New York City is beginning to sort of explore this. How are employers reacting? It's not always through reducing hours. It's not always through reducing employment. It's doing other things. And I think as economists, we don't necessarily think that those are bad things. We just tend not to focus on them.
But that's like,
Can I jump in? Just a quick comment. Mark mentioned our studies were finding disemployment effects far outside of others, and that's true. But I just want to kind of contextualize, give an anecdote to think about how large our effects were. So we're finding somewhere between 6 and 9% reduction in employment. I was with right after our study came out. I was with my 11-year-old son at a McDonald's, and it was a McDonald's I'd been to before. But when we got there, we saw that they had a kiosk for ordering, and I asked my son to count the number of workers that we could observe in the back of McDonald's, and there were 10. And I asked, well, what would how many cashiers are these kiosks replacing? And we estimated probably one fewer cashier. Well, right there, that's a 9% reduction in employment, right? So it doesn't take a lot to have a disemployment effect that offsets the wage effect completely with these kind of mechanizing or other kind of adjustment factors. So even if what you see in our results is a large effect, it's a plausible effect given that there are these other adjustment mechanisms. Finally, just one other comment to respond to something Mark said. I would be fully in favor of public employment at $15 an hour as a guarantee, and then let the private employers compete with that. And many employees would accept a lower wage at a private firm if that offered a better progression or more training. But if they didn't find that appealing, they could take the public sector employment. So the city leaders here in Seattle kind of believe that there'd be no disemployment effects, and I would have liked to have seen them, in essence, put their money where their mouth is and make that public guarantee.
But there's at least two problems with that approach. Number one, it costs public resources, public dollars. At the in the federal level, we're living in an era of fiscal madness. When we throw trillions in tax cuts.
Just fiscal?
Well, that's the one I'm going to focus on. And if you don't do that, if you're doing it at the state level, then you have some states that are flush with the kind of the coastal cities and states, and a lot of states don't have those kind of resources. I also think if you guaranteed $15 an hour, well, you put a lot of sort of low wage small employers out of business. I just think they will not be able to compete with that. No one will want to work. So I have a little less confidence in that. I mean, I'll say the one thing about the minimum wages, they are popular with the voters. So all these voters that vote Tea Party, because they want their taxes to go up to pay for all these alternatives, they say, why not the minimum wage? They don't think about demand curves and things like that. So even in red states, you put these things in the ballot, they almost always pass. And it's pretty well known, if Paul Ryan ever put a federal minimum wage bill on the floor, it would pass overwhelmingly. These things are popular with their constituents, and of course they make sure not to put it on the floor. But that's, all of the alternatives that we are proposing do cost way more public resources than the alternative of just mandating, and that's a downside for those of us who are arguing for all these alternative things, and especially the public service jobs and the subsidies that cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I saw your hand starting to go up.
Yeah, so I'm curious about the hours that you were talking about, Dr. Long, because so this is shifting the conversation a little bit, but one of the things that we found, which I'll present on shortly, is that some people really like that they're working fewer hours because they're able to spend more time with their families. Now, if they're losing net costs in their household income, that's a different story. So I'm just curious if you could add a little more detail. Are these fewer regular hours? Are they fewer overtime hours? Are they dropping people from full-time to part-time? Like what, if you could just elaborate on what those hours look like, or that hour loss looks like.
Yeah, on your first point, you're absolutely right. We are not measuring welfare or utility. And I think that's actually a useful thing to think about. So your earnings may be going down, but your hours are also going down, and it's not clear how much better or worse off you are in terms of your happiness. We've not looked at the overtime issue or like which specific hours are being lost. So I can't answer that question. It's probably something we can do subsequently. One of the things we're doing is we are working with the state to put together a broader administrative data set. So the administrative data set that we have currently is from unemployment insurance records, but that lacks a lot of contextual or individual demographic characteristics that you'd like to know about, like age, gender, race. We're putting together, and family formation. So we're putting together a data set with other state resources that will allow us to answer questions about what's the impact on households. Is it lowering hours of teenagers, or is it lowering hours of workers with children? And I think that's going to allow us to get closer to an answer of the welfare side of the question, or the utility side of the question, than we currently have.
Okay, I look forward to that.
Yes, please.
I had a question around sort of, does the economy and the performance of the economy overall matters in the effects of minimum wage adjustment? So in other words, is this, if it would be implemented these times with the strong economy and very low unemployment rate, would the effects be different than when it would be implemented in the other times?
Sure, the disemployment would be much smaller. The problem is, and especially, for the places that are phasing in the $15 really slowly, the problem is we're not going to stay in this place forever. And most economists think, we got this injection into the economy, $1 trillion tax cuts, that will keep us at a high level of activity. Most economists think for about two more years. 2020, 2021, that's when you risk the next downturn, just when really high minimum wages, I think, will be coming online in those places. Yeah, if you could stay in and of course those localities that have perennially tight labor markets, there's a stronger case, and Seattle is one of them.
And that's still in theory, right? The sorting out what the employment impact difference between the top of the business cycle versus the bottom is not empirically robust.
I think
it's a problem of measurement, right?
No, I think, yeah. And again, we have no evidence on the 15 at all. In the literature that people like David Newmark review, I think they do look at some of these interaction effects. Yeah, but we're not going to stay here.
Just trying to see if from an advocacy standpoint, if that is part of the narrative or part of the debate, that now is better time than later.
Yeah, and of course in Washington, D.C., the advocates are also saying, look at all the cranes out there, look at all the building going on. It's like, as if that's never going to dry up. Of course, in the last year or two, in fact, in D.C., the employment growth has been pretty flat. One of the things that none of us talked about, if the only thing you were doing was a high minimum wage, it may not be so burdensome to the employers, but in a place like, and this is what I worry about, a lot of the blue states, the very blue cities, the places that are raising the minimum to 15 are also doing all of these other things to mandate higher costs to employers. Mandating benefits, mandating paid family leave, mandating ban the box. Each of those, if they were the only thing that might make sense collectively. I hear, you go to the DC Chamber of Commerce, and it's a very liberal chamber. It's almost entirely African American folks who grew up in the city and really have, and they are pulling their hair out, to use your metaphor. They want to leave. They can't stand how many mandates the city council has imposed on them. So it's not just the aggregate health, it's also all the other stuff that often comes with it.
And you said the word advocacy. From my perspective, because that's my role, there is never a good time to raise wages. So you never have a adult conversation. We're having an adult conversation here. In public policy, we do not have adult conversations. So if we're at the bottom of the business cycle, so if we're in the middle of a recession, the very first argument that is going to come by the heads of the local chamber is going to be that this is the worst possible time to raise wages. My God, you're going to cause unemployment to spike. when we are right where we are right now. It is the worst possible time to raise wages because it's going to lead to a dramatic loss in employment and drive us into a recession. There are folks in Harrisburg who actually say, and so we don't have in the advocacy world adult conversations like that. And I would actually sort of discourage you from even worrying about it. It's just, public policy is very ugly, and you just do your best to sort of put forward what you think is a reasonable argument and hope that you don't get described as a fake news economist.
So Harrisburg is no better than DC.
Harrisburg is a cesspool as noble and bright as every other cesspool in New Jersey.
So, and here you talked about the high road employers, and I know that's something that Mark from Keystone had focused on, the high road. And, you know, I've heard some talk around that the bigger employers can better absorb these kind of increases, and it's the smaller ones that are more likely to get hurt in the process. What do we know about policies that can help those smaller shops absorb these increases? What do we know about that?
I don't know. We haven't. Yeah, we don't have a lot of evidence of imposing this level of cost. I'll give you one example. I think that happened in the hotel industry. What I would sort of, again, I don't know if this is cause and effect. That when the SEIU started unionizing a lot of hotels and pushing up the wages of the folks who clean the rooms and things like that, a lot of hotels started to move in the direction of not automatic cleaning every room every day. You know, the hotels that start putting up, you know, you have to put a sign out if you want your room, which I imagine cut into the required work a good. So that you have all these mechanisms, I think, to get around the problem. I'll tell you one other story in DC, and the DC Council can really be out of control and authority with the mayor's side. When Walmart was talking about coming into DC and building a number of stores, the city council passed a minimum wage law saying specifically big box stores, they said, are going to get, you know, a really high minimum high. Warren says we're done. We're not going to move there anymore. So employers have a lot of mechanisms, but I don't know, you know, what you can do to help small employers adjust. And I think they will look for creative ways to avoid those costs. Again, either by relocating or automating, or as I said, by raising the bar at the front end. That might be the, you know, places that show no loss of employment at the establishment level. I think, again, we don't have a huge amount of evidence on it. You know, if you have to pay somebody $15, they better be someone who reads and writes well and whom I can trust you. You know, so the firms make those kinds of adjustments, but I don't know how to help them make adjustments that we might prefer as policymakers that wouldn't exclude the folks we care about.
Can I add one thing on this? So one of the things that Seattle did in their law was that they had a different phase-in schedule for small employers and large employers, with it phasing in faster for large employers. There are, I think, though, two problems with that. One is that they differentiated large and small by 500 employees. They didn't initially in the law specify if that was 500 employees nationally or internationally. It eventually got interpreted as internationally. Most of the employers and their employees don't know if they have more than 500 employees nationally. Particularly, this is a problem for franchises where the franchises were deemed their employment count was based on the total franchise. So if you're a Subway owner with one Subway shop that you own, you're called a large employer because Subway internationally employs more than 500 workers, whereas the local franchise owner would say, look, I have no ability to raise prices or to tap into corporate profits. I'm a franchisor. So you get into some challenges in how you decide where to draw the line between the businesses that you're going to try to help because you think they can't absorb it as fast. The other thing to say is the larger employers also probably have more ability to relocate in ways that the smaller employers don't. And so you might expect those employers to respond more in terms of employment than the smaller employers. Harry mentioned Walmart. That's a perfect example, right? They have the ability to choose where they locate in ways that if you're a mom and pop deli, you don't.
Although, again, you know, think of the state of Pennsylvania. and think of the credibility of the threat that Walmart's going to move all of its stores to where, right? People aren't going to drive a long distance to go to local shopping. So I think, I also encourage you not to overplay the sort of the mobility issues, particularly if you're talking about fast food franchises. We're going to leave the city of Pittsburgh. Where are your customers? They're in the city of Pittsburgh, right? I think I would apply the same logic to Walmart. I mean, this really comes to one of the issues that you will have to face if you ever got the chance to raise wages in in Pittsburgh, is Walmart has a lot more flexibility if Pittsburgh raises its minimum wage or Allegheny County does, and then Walmart can maybe locate around the county, right? So I think that's where that matters. Context matters a lot.
So I think we have time for one more comment. Anybody?
To me, and I apologize, I had to take a phone call, but the studies to me sort of always read more like the kind of more like a kind of right-wing playbook than anything else. Not less like kind of the facts on the ground. Although obviously it is the facts on the ground, because I think what everybody has pointed to is that the blunt instrument of a minimum wage law outside of any power to control any of the other things that matter, taxes and, do we have wraparound? Do we have a competitor in the public sector? Do we have any of those things? Really can't, that's where you produce these effects, when the only factors that we're allowed to fool around with are unencumbered private sector employers and politicians who will or will not do this one thing. We can't maximize the benefit of that one thing, and we may, in fact, step on our own feet. And so to me, one of the reasons that I worry about it is because when we have reports like this, the only people who will use them are the people who don't want us even to do that one thing, let alone control the other factors. And so I think it's important to make sure that we're having this conversation. For instance, with the hotel workers, that you can say to people, okay, well, we're going to clean the room half as often, and so now we have a disemployment effect. Or you can do what they did in Australia, which was simultaneously pass some cleanliness standards, and then that option has been eliminated, right? I mean, in Washington State, I think one of the reasons why home care workers have been able to kind of do as much as they've been able to do to upgrade that workforce is because they managed to grab control of a huge number of factors, from training to taxes to who gets in front of the consumer to who gets whatever. So I would just say, when I read this report, it says, well, maybe we ought to think about being less ambitious. To me, we ought to think about being more ambitious if we really want to make an impact on the lives of low-wage workers.
So thank you, everybody. I think you can see we had a great panel. Harry, Mark, and Mark, we appreciate your early rising. I'm sure from what Mark Price said, he used the easy pass and not the person at the toll booth because he prefers the technological change.
We did write a report about
but I also think they've given us a lot to think about with regard to that wages are just one part of the story, and that we have to think about other things that we can use to both motivate or to balance. So I want to really, again, give you my thanks for participating. And I think we all really appreciate it.